Hello there, fifth grade. It is Friday, the 27th of March, and we're going to be doing some history together today. So if you will turn in your book, we're in chapter 14, to page 165. We will get started. We're going to be looking at CompCheck 14B and the information that we're going to learn within that CompCheck. So I'm going to look at the CompCheck now on page 168 and see the kind of highlights we'll be looking for. Number 1 says, what animal provided the Indians with food, shelter, and clothing? Number 2 says, what is a reservation? Number 3 says, what is a transcontinental railroad? Go back to 4th grade. We talked about California history. We talked about that. And number 4, when and where was the transcontinental railroad finished? All right. So, let's look at the last frontier on page 165. So it says, after the end of the Civil War, Americans once again began to feel the urge to move west. Many Northerners could not find jobs when they got back from the war. Many Southerners came home to find that their farms and cities had been destroyed in the fighting. These returning soldiers had heard stories of the West. Eager to forget the hardships of the war and make a new way of living for themselves, Northerners and Southerners alike began to look to the West, where there was still plenty of free land waiting for them. Before long, wagons were once again rumbling over the western trails headed for the last frontier. This was to be the last great westward movement. It was a period of cowboys and Indians and farmers, each trying to gain control of the West. It was a period of great danger and great excitement. So after the war, especially for Southerners, but not only Southerners, but especially for them, going home to a desolate, we talked yesterday about the desolation in the South, was sad and hard. And so sometimes when things are really tough, we don't want to go back there again. So we will move forward. So many of them packed up and thought, let's start over somewhere else. Okay, that makes sense? All right, so they started heading west, and this was the last westward movement. We have seen that the West kept moving over as settlers moved into a region. Many years had passed since Daniel Boone led many of the first pioneers into Kentucky. Since then, there had been a continual movement of pioneers traveling westward. Bit by bit, the frontier was shrinking. By the middle of the 1800s, California and Oregon had already begun settlement. The West had reached the Pacific Ocean. The Great Plains and the area around the Rocky Mountains remained the last frontier to settle. When the West reached the Pacific Ocean, what was once called the West became known as the Midwest. From ocean to ocean, all regions were becoming settled, and modern America was taking shape. So let me just quickly go back here, and I want to show you a map. We looked at that in chapter 12. And so here is where the original 13 colonies were. And as the people moved westward, I should say, they started to live in this area, and then they moved a little farther west. So the West kept moving until we get all the way to where we are in Los Angeles, in California. Okay, so I'm going to say that again. Started in the original 13 colonies here, and as people started moving westward, farther west, we ended up being from sea, Atlantic Ocean, to shining sea, Pacific Ocean. Okay, so that's what they're talking about. And this here, the Wilderness Road and whatnot in Kentucky, this here became known as the Midwest, as the West moved farther towards the Pacific Ocean. Okay, so that should make sense. So let's go, let me find my page, go back to page 166. And I'm going to read that part again. When the West reached the Pacific Ocean, what was once called the West became known as the Midwest. From ocean to ocean, all regions were becoming settled, and modern America was taking shape, like the map I just showed you. So, the Indians of the West. At the time of the Civil War, many Native Americans lived in the Great Plains region. Huge buffalo herds roamed through this country. The buffalo was an important animal in an Indian's life. It provided the Indians with meat to eat. The buffalo hides or skins were used to make clothing in teepees. Even the bones were used to make tools. No other animal could provide these Indians with food, shelter, and clothing. So the buffalo were essential, very important to the Indians. After the Civil War, pioneers began to build settlements on the Great Plains. Little by little, the Native Americans watched land that they considered theirs being taken away. Many could not understand that their way of life would have to change as the United States grew. Soon the white men began to kill off the buffalo herds. Some men came from the east to hunt the buffalo for its hides that could be sold back east. Some men came just to shoot the buffalo for sport. Soon there were fewer and fewer buffalo. So for the Indians, that was horrific. That was detrimental to them. They used the buffalo for shelter, for clothing, for tools, for food. And now some of the white men from the east just came to hunt the buffalo for sport. That's what they're living off of. But for the white men, it was just for fun, just for sport. So that certainly isn't going to be a way for the Indians and the white men to get along or to learn about each other in a good and godly way. Also, some came to hunt them for the hides that they could sell back east. Take them home back east to where they came from and sell them. And so the Indians were seeing their lives change, and it wasn't their choice. They were being forced off of their land. They were being pushed farther and farther off of the land that they've lived in their whole lives, that their ancestors and the greats that came before them forged and built lives on that land. And we know how important from history, from other things we've spoken of, how important land was to the Indians and their culture and their heritage and their way of life and their beliefs. So this was horrible time for the Indians. The white men had broken many promises. Many Indians decided they must not be forced to move again. They determined to fight for what they believed was theirs. Indian wars followed. There was cruelty on both sides in this sad part of our country's history. The Indians had many false religions that influenced their way of life and which made it hard for the Indians and the white men to get along. They didn't understand each other. Yet few white men tried earnestly to teach the Native Americans about Christianity. Many on each side made little effort to understand the other. Each side fought for what they believed was theirs. So you're never going to come into any kind of agreement or any kind of compromise if people aren't willing to listen to each other and try to work together and try to understand each other. And so we see that in our history. Now, obviously, the Indians' religion was obviously a false religion, and they were following nature and whatnot, and instead of the creator of nature, our God, the one and true and only God. And so there was no understanding there. But what should have happened, as we read about, is that the believers should have loved the Indians and taught the Indians instead of taking things from them, loving them and encouraging them and being generous and kind to them and showing them Jesus through their actions. But that wasn't what was happening at this point in time, and there were many Indian wars that were followed. Now, it's important to know, even though the white men took the Indians' land, it's important to know that there was cruelty on both sides. Okay? Finally, the United States government sent great numbers of soldiers to the west to fight the Indians. One by one, the Indian tribes were defeated and forced to move onto reservations, which are pieces of land that the United States has set aside for the Indians. Here they were promised protection. So they were taken from their homeland and they were forced, key word is forced, to live on reservations. And often they were forced to live on reservations with tribes that they were enemies with, tribes that have different languages, different traditions, different customs, and they couldn't even communicate with each other or try to learn from each other, especially if they were enemies. So it was not home sweet home for them by any means. All right? So in 1924, our government passed a law which made Native American citizens of the United States. Gradually, Since that time, I'm on page 167, a greater understanding and friendship has developed between the white man and the Indian. Today, Indians are an important part of the American population. So we see here in the pictures at the bottom of that page, you see the Indians hunting the buffalo, which we talked about was so very important to them. A gold spike for the railroad. In the early part of the 1800s, some people felt that California and Oregon were too far from the east to become states. However, the coming of the railroad changed people's minds. Little by little, railroads were improved. Men began to dream of a railroad that could connect the east and the west. We talked about that in 4th grade last year. So men began to dream of a railroad that could connect the east with the west. Soon plans were made to build a railroad that would cross the continent from coast to coast, our country's first transcontinental railroad. Building a transcontinental railroad would be a long, difficult job. The track would not only have to be laid across the prairies and plains, but also around and up and down mountains. 2 railroad companies would work on this tremendous job, the Union Pacific Company and the Central Pacific Company. Work was begun in 1862 during the Civil War. The Union Pacific began work in Omaha, Nebraska. A railroad had already been built this far from the east. The Union Pacific workers built their tracks westward from Omaha. The Central Pacific began work in Sacramento, California, our capital, and built their tracks towards the east. Somewhere in the middle there, these 2 railroad companies would meet and join to form our first transcontinental railroad. Okay, so I can go back and show you this map real quick. Let me get a map of the United States up here to show you. I'm looking in the back of our book here. And we can see on page 248 and 249, if you want to look. I don't have enough fingers to point out, but find Nebraska, right here. Nebraska, and we know the capital of Nebraska is Lincoln, very good. And here's Nebraska, and here's Sacramento, which is our capital. And a railroad had already been built from the east to Omaha, Nebraska. And now you're going to have one railroad company begin building in Nebraska, the other in Sacramento, and we're going to meet at a place called Promontory Point in Utah, okay? So they're both going to meet, building on 2 different ends and then coming together. So the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. The Union Pacific, like I said, began in Omaha, Nebraska, the Central Pacific in Sacramento, California. So many years of hard work went into this job. There were no stores along the way to buy supplies and food for the 20,000 workers. Trains would carry the needed supplies to the workers as far as the new tracks were finished. Buffalo were shot for fresh meat. The workers did not have an easy job. Summer days were hot and the winter days cold. Indians often attacked the working men. Day by day, the 2 sets of tracks came closer and closer to joining each other. The 2 railroad companies raced each other to see which company would finish the most miles of tracks. Finally, on May 10th, 1869, a Union Pacific locomotive traveling west met a Central Pacific locomotive, it's another word for a train, traveling east. The place where the 2 railroads met was Promontory Point, Utah, which I illustrated for you just a few minutes ago. So here's a picture of the railroad workers building the tracks. We know that a lot of Chinese were vital in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and the railroad in general throughout our nation. And so you can see the train in the distance here would bring the supplies as far as they could, and then they would give them to the railroad workers, and then they would go back and get more, bring them a little farther as more track was laid, back and forth until they met at Promontory Point, Utah. All right, so let's turn the page. I'm on page 168, but the Great Railroad was not finished yet. The last long nail or spike needed to be driven into the rails at their, let me try that again. The last long nail or spike needed to be driven into the rails at their meeting place. An ordinary spike could not be used for such a great event. Amidst the sound of cheers and the blows of sledgehammers, a gold spike was driven into the last rail. This transcontinental railroad brought tremendous changes to our country. Number one, it helped to settle the West. More and more people could come easier. And number two, the East was brought closer to the West. Same concept, obviously. Settlers began traveling west in trains rather than in slow wagons. People from the East could visit people who had moved west. So there's more of a connection. Farmers and businessmen from the West could send their products back east by train to sell them. In return, they could buy supplies from the East. So not only could people come and move from the east to the west, they could send products back and forth. They could visit each other. We were more connected, just like we're enjoying being connected through our YouTube channel, even though we're apart, or by FaceTiming or phone calls or emails. You might be Zooming your family members. You might be on group FaceTime or Skype with your friends and family, keeping in touch. They have a railroad to help them keep in touch, going back and forth. Now we see a picture here, and I told you many of the Chinese were involved in creating our railroad. And it says the Transcontinental Railroad was built across rugged mountains, through deep valleys, and over miles of endless plains. And there's a picture of the gunpowder used to blow through the mountains, the nitroglycerin. We talked about that last year in 4th grade, how they would put it, chip into the rock and put the dynamite in there and the nitroglycerin, light the fuse. They'd need to run as fast as they could. That was the blasters that would blast through the rock. Those men were really in danger day in and day out, and many got hurt. They had the most dangerous job, but you can see how powerful in that picture that it's blowing huge chunk of rock, and that's how they get through the mountains. All right, so very dangerous job, very hard job, but so vital and important to uniting us as a country so that we can see each other and we can move from place to place. All right, so that is our comp check for today, and we will begin talking more about the American cowboy when we come back on Monday for further history lessons. All right, so I will talk to you soon. Work hard, do a good job, and make sure that you understand everything before you answer any questions. No need to rush through. Do the best you can, and I will see you on Monday for more history.